Shabbat. That exhausts my Swedish. I know no other words in Swedish. So apologies for having to speak in English, but your English, no matter what level it is far better than my Swedish. So it's wonderful to be here. Thank you so much. I'm a little surprised to be here, quite frankly, because Olga has heard me speak. Now, I get invited to speak in many places, but I almost never get invited back to speak a second time, so I'm not sure what's happening here. But I was here for the Women's Forum conference a year ago and met a lot of amazing folks, and it really is exciting to be back. Pornographic Distortions, the struggle for intimacy in the 21st century. The first thing I want to make clear is that's the only slide. There will be no images, and that's important because in dealing with the question of pornography, it's possible to illustrate much of what I want to say with images, but those images can be extremely distressing for reasons that you probably all know and we'll talk more about. And I prefer not to use those images, not to put more pornography out in the world. There are a couple of points where I will describe pornographic images in somewhat blunt fashion. Apologize ahead of time for that, but I think it is important to know what we're dealing with here. Let me first sketch what I hope to do in the time before lunch. The first thing I want to do is talk a bit about the concept of patriarchy. It's okay to talk about patriarchy here? Okay. I'm not in the US, in other words. Yes. In the US, you say the word, it's, people get very nervous. So I want to talk about that and why that's so important to the way I have come to see the world. Then I'll talk a bit about the pornography industry and the images it produces. Then we'll deal with this question of pornographic distortions. And then perhaps say a bit about feminism at the end. Sound okay? All right. So let's use this term patriarchy. We live in the United States in a patriarchal society. In Sweden, we live in a patriarchal. I'm just looking around for confirmation. You know, I forgot I'm in Sweden. Everybody's very polite. You know, I don't know, what does he want us to do? It's okay. Feedback is fine. So I'm well aware that one of my jobs in the world, probably the only important job I have in the world, is to be me. That is an older guy who stands up and says, patriarchy, 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 patriarchy. I am the person who stands up and tries to make it okay to say patriarchy. Because, of course, when women say patriarchy, the first question is, why do you hate men? Yes? Right? What do you got against men? So that's a way of acknowledging that I'm aware of the kind of curious position I'm in. I'm a man working in a feminist anti-pornography movement, a movement that was created by and fueled by women. And I have a role in that. My role is not to pretend to have, you know, broken new ground and created new ideas. My role is to work behind those women and make it clear that men can embrace this critique as well. So I do that with a real awareness of the women who've come before me. And I always want to mention two. One is Andrea Dworkin, the late radical feminist in the United States, without whose work I wouldn't be here. And the other is Gail Dines, who's a longtime friend and co-author of mine, who I know has been in Sweden. Some of you may have seen her. And without Gail, I don't think I would be able to keep doing all this work. So with that, let's talk just a bit about patriarchy, because it is a term that some people would say is outdated. It's not used as commonly as it might have been 30, 40 years ago. So my understanding of patriarchy is that it's centered on men's claim to a right to own or control women's reproductive power and women's sexuality. That's the core of patriarchy. Societies where men claim to own or control women, which means that, of course, reproductive rights are a central issue when one is challenging patriarchy, and sexual violence is a central issue in the challenge of patriarchy. But my own work has been centered on what I would call the sexual exploitation industries. Pornography, prostitution, stripping, the most common ways that men routinely buy and sell women's bodies for sexual pleasure. The way that men buy and sell objectified female bodies for their own pleasure. The sexual exploitation industries, I think, are part of patriarchy, but at least in the United States, while there will be within feminism a shared goal of reproductive rights and combating sexual violence, in the United States, there's no guarantee that even people within the feminist movement will challenge the sexual exploitation industries, and that's what I think we're trying to do here today. So how is patriarchy manifested in the sexual exploitation industries? And I'm going to talk today specifically about pornography. Well, we can look at the experience of women who are used in the production of pornography, which people have done excellent work on. We can look at the actual content of pornography, the actual images that are produced and distributed. And then we can look at men's use of pornography. And in each of those examinations, we will find a deeply patriarchal industry producing patriarchal images used in patriarchal ways. Again, ways in which men claim a right to own or control women's bodies and use them for sexual pleasure. You figured out now this isn't going to be fun, yes? But that's what we need to deal with. Okay. I'm gonna forego a discussion of the experience of women in the industry. We can talk more about that at lunch if you like, but I know that that's already been a topic. So I want to talk just briefly about the actual images. And again, I'm not going to show you any slides, but I do want to talk a bit about why the pornography industry produces images that are so deeply patriarchal, and that requires talking a bit about those images. Right? And one has to do that rather bluntly. I'll try and do it in kind of a clinical fashion. So back to Andrea Dworkin. I mentioned her work was so important to the feminist anti-pornography movement starting in the 1970s in the US. In response to that critique, people would often say, well, I don't know what your problem is with pornography. Pornography is just sex on film. And human beings are sexual, yes? Human beings have sex. Man, you Swedish people are so serious. People have sex, yes? It's okay, we can... Man, I just came from Germany. Those Germans are a laugh a minute compared to you folks. Just kidding. Just make sure you... You know, humor doesn't always work cross-culturally. You always have to make sure you're marking your jokes when you're in another country. Okay. Pornography is just sex on film. Human beings are sexual. What's the big deal? But Andrea pointed out that pornography is not just everyday human sexuality on film. It's sexuality in the context of a domination-subordination dynamic. The primary domination, subordination, and dynamic in heterosexual pornography, that is, the pornography produced by men for men, is primarily men's domination of women, the subordination of women through sex. But Andrea pointed out that once you sexualize the domination-subordination dynamic in sex-gender, that same domination-subordination dynamic will play out in other forms of hierarchy. And we know there are other forms of hierarchy in the world. In the pornography, especially that produced in the United States, it's also extremely racist. Right? Racist pornography, using the domination-subordination dynamic in white supremacy to sexualize that power. So pornography is not just sex on film, it's domination and subordination made erotic, made sexual. And that was Andrea's central insight. And that changed the way a lot of us thought about pornography. Okay. To demonstrate that, I'm going to describe 5 practices, sexual practices that are routine in contemporary pornography. These are practices that you will find not in every single pornographic film or every pornographic website, but you will find them so consistently that they can only be described as normal. Right? A reminder of how crazy normal is in the contemporary world. So I'm going to describe these 5 practices, which I think demonstrate Andrea's central insight. Okay. the practices are double penetration, double vag, double anal, gagging, and ATM. All right, so I'll go through those one by one and explain it. Double penetration is a term in the pornography industry for a scene in which a woman is penetrated anally and vaginally by two men at the same time. That's a double penetration scene. Okay? Double vag is an industry term for a scene in which a woman is penetrated vaginally by two men at the same time. Kind of following this. Double anal is a scene in which a woman is penetrated anally by two men at the same time. These are all what are called multiple penetration scenes in contemporary pornography. These, again, are routine. You don't have to search out to find these. A simple web search will produce literally thousands, hundreds of thousands of these images at this point. All right. I remember speaking to a pornography producer at the annual pornography convention in the United States, which of course happens in Las Vegas. Where else would the porn people get together? I always say I don't recommend the porn convention in Las Vegas as a vacation destination. It was one of the most difficult things I've ever done, actually. And I was talking to this porn producer about some of these practices. And he said, yeah, we shot a DVDA once. And that was new to me. I said, DVDA? He said, yeah, double vag, double anal. A woman penetrated with 4 phalluses at once. I said, quizzically, 4 men? He said, no, we had her in a harness, but we couldn't line up 4 male bodies, so one of them was a dildo. Okay. That's the way the pornography industry works. It asks, how can we intensify that domination-subordination dynamic, whatever way is necessary? I'm not a woman, but I can imagine that a DVDA comes with a certain amount of both psychological and physical distress. You can ask yourselves about your own experiences and whether these practices, double penetration, double vag, double anal, are practices that, in your experience, women routinely seek out in the world. Right? They're pornographic practices. These are not practices that came out of everyday life and people said, well, let's just make a film about this because everybody's doing it. Okay. Gagging. Gagging films are what are called all oral films, where the goal is for the man to penetrate the woman orally to the point where she gags. And in some of these films, they'll actually show women vomiting. They've been penetrated so deeply. That's a gagging film, and they're very popular. ATM is the most recent innovation, if you want to call it that, in the porn industry. It's been around now for a number of years. ATM is industry jargon for ass to mouth. An ATM scene is a scene in which a woman is penetrated anally by a man, and that man, without any visible hygiene, places his penis in the mouth of the woman or another woman, ass to mouth. Now, of course, there's editing going on, so we don't know if there's actual hygiene that is conducted on set. But that really doesn't matter, because the point is this film is holding out to men that you are watching a man remove his penis from an anus and put it into a woman's mouth. Right? Now, I remember Gail Dines, my friend, who has a way with words, put it this way. She said, ass to mouth is literally getting sexual pleasure from watching women eat shit. Pardon the language. All right, that's it. That ends my discussion of the pornographic practices. But I think Andrea's point becomes quite obvious. What is the excitement behind and the attraction of these sexual practices, if not to heighten that sense of male power? These are not sexual practices that are routine in the population. And I want to make a point here. There's a lot of individual variation in the human species. We're not all alike. And I don't assume that everyone's sexual preferences and sexual practices mirror my own. Right? There's differences. But I know of no study, and I have never spoken to women who indicate that any of these sexual practices are common in everyday life. They are created by the porn industry, and it's hard to imagine the reason for the creation of them except to sexualize domination and subordination, to eroticize male power. I can imagine no other explanation. That is the pornographic world. Now, a quick digression. I'm talking about heterosexual pornography. That is, pornography that depicts primarily heterosexual sex for a primarily heterosexual male consumer base. There are other kinds of pornography. There's gay male pornography. There's a much smaller lesbian pornography market. Like anything else in human endeavors, there's a lot of variation. But this heterosexual pornography is the model for the industry, and it's the pornography that generates the most profit. Right? So that's the world. Now, I no longer do research on these images. I wrote a book about 10 years ago, and that was the last study I did because I found myself at a point where I could no longer look at these and cope emotionally. But I've kept up with the work of others, and the industry continues on this same trajectory. And from all of this work, my own examinations over the 30 years and the research, I'd like to distill what I think is the story pornography tells. That is, if you look at the vast majority of heterosexual pornography, there's really only one story, and here it is. All women always want sex from all men. The sexual acts that women want are exactly the ones that men demand, and that any woman who does not immediately understand that this is in fact her true sexual self will understand it as soon as a little bit of force is applied. There are millions of pornographic images, but they all tell basically the same story, that story. All women want sex from all men all the time. Women want exactly the sexual acts men prefer, and if you don't understand that, it won't take you long to learn it. Now, we have a number of women in the room today. I don't assume you're a representative sample of women in Sweden or in the world, but let's just take a minute and reflect. Those of you who are women, is that an accurate account of your sexuality? Right. That is the pornographic distortion. This constant barrage of images that tell that one story. Right? Now, that might be disturbing, but don't worry. Pornography has no effects in the world, and we don't have to worry about it. Well, at least some of you realize I was kidding about that. When you present this information to people who don't want to give up pornography, that's the claim they make, yes? All right, so let's talk a bit about pornography and its effect in the world, which means primarily talking about what the habitual use of pornography means for men's sexual imagination. That's really what we're talking about. How do men understand sexuality when they are raised on a steady diet of images like this? Okay. Well, one question is, what are the effects of these pornographic images on rates of sexual assault? And I'm not going to say much about that because that's a hard question. To try and connect media to any particular human behavior is difficult. If any of you have done work in the social sciences or media effects, it's not easy to know what media images, and we live in this mass-mediated world, we're constantly exposed to images. It's hard to know what is the connection between the images themselves and behavior. Take the question of violent video games. Yes, it's a big concern in the US, I'm sure here. Do young people, primarily young men, who play violent video games act out in violent ways at greater rates? It's hard to know. That is not an easy question to answer. There are a lot of questions in the social sciences that aren't easy to answer. We'd love answers to them, but we don't necessarily have them. All right. We know that images have some effect on how people come to think, and we know that the way people think affects the way they behave in the world. We can say that much. Media images affect our consciousness and affect our behavior, but we don't know much about how that is. there's at least one industry that gives us good evidence that that does in fact happen, and that's the advertising industry. Yes? The advertising industry in the US spends about $400 billion a year to flood our consciousness with images. I don't think they do it just for fun. They do it because it works. But there's a joke in the advertising industry. Only half of our advertisements work. We just don't know which half. In other words, even the advertising industry, which expends extraordinary amounts of money to create and study the effects of advertising, aren't exactly sure how it happens. But there's good reason to believe from social science research and our own experience that images affect the way we think about the world. And of course, the way we think about the world does affect the way we behave. But I'm not going to make an argument that pornography causes rape. The feminist anti-pornography movement was often accused of arguing that pornography causes rape, and I think that's way too simplistic. I think that the way I would say it, borrowing language from a feminist philosopher I've worked with, pornography creates a world in which rape becomes more inviting. It's the language from a feminist philosopher named Marilyn Frye. It makes rape inviting, but that isn't the same thing as saying it causes it. All right? So I'm a cautious person by nature when it comes to making claims. I don't like to make claims beyond what evidence I think exists. But in addition to how pornography may be connected to rates of sexual violence, a question difficult to answer, made even more difficult because we don't have good data on rates of sexual violence. Right? We have studies of various kinds, but the actual rate of sexual violence in any culture is very difficult to identify, for a simple reason, that even victims of sexual violence don't always identify their own experience as violence. So when people say they know how much sexual violence exists in the world, I'm skeptical. I think from my own experience, I think the estimates are always low. All right, but let's put that question aside. We do have an increasing amount of data and stories and self-reports from both men and women about the effect of pornography on people's intimate relationships. Yes? Because in addition to violence that is unwanted, we're often in relationships, and in heterosexual relationships, especially with this pornographic saturated world, there are some things we can say. And to point this out, I'm going to quote from a recent article in an American magazine quoting a sex researcher from a university in the US. And she was giving advice to young men. And I'm not making this up. This was in a major American magazine. I just realized you might discount it precisely. Well, it's an American magazine. We can't believe that. Who can believe anything that comes out of the United States? I probably should have not introduced it that way, but anyway. She said, again, advice to young men in the dating world. If you're with somebody for the first time, don't choke them, don't ejaculate on their face, don't try to have anal sex with them. These are all things that are just unlikely to go over well. I'm going to read that one again. If you're with somebody for the first time, don't choke them, don't ejaculate on their face, don't try to have anal sex with them. These are all things that are just unlikely to go over well. Wow, that's some really insightful advice, yes? Okay, but why would a sex researcher offer that advice to young men? Well, guess what? Pornography is full of images where men are choking women in the context of sexual arousal and sexual penetration. They are full of images of men ejaculating onto women's faces, and in heterosexual pornography, anal sex is commonplace. Again, I'm not saying that there are no women who don't enjoy a variety of... I'm not here to tell women what their sexual practices should be. I just know that those sexual practices are not common in the list of heterosexual women's desires. Okay? But in a pornographic world saturated with these kind of images, a noted sex researcher feels the need to offer young men the advice that on the face of it seems like a joke. Right? She goes on, if you're a young woman and you're having sex and somebody tries to choke you, I just don't know if you'd want to go back for more right away. This is the world we live in. It is a pornographic world. I'm not saying that every man who in an intimate relationship engages in these kind of activities is doing it precisely because of exposure to porn. But I know from talking to many, many men, especially younger men, that this habitual use of porn, that is, pornography use that the men themselves are uncomfortable with but find themselves unable to resist. Some would call it porn addiction. I don't use the term myself because there's a big controversy among psychologists and neuroscientists, and I'm neither of those things, about whether pornography use is addictive. I think the evidence is quickly demonstrating that, like gambling and other kinds of behaviors, it can be, for all intents and purposes, addictive. But whether one agrees with that term or not, men themselves report an inability to disengage from their own use of pornography and report, again, we're not only talking about women's reports of how men behave with them, we're talking about men's self-reports about their own ability to be sexually active without these pornographic images flooding their own imagination. Right? And in a world where everyone knows that anyone, including 10-year-old boys, essentially have instant access to these images, if we're not thinking about this, I don't think we're being responsible adults. I do not see how anyone working with young people can do that without an awareness that this is the background noise of young boys and young men's life. Okay. Now, that's kind of a downer, yes? Let's talk about the struggle for intimacy in the 21st century. Yeah, it's not going to be any prettier. I mean, you know, we're... All right. The only thing I really want to say about that is, you know, in liberal societies, and I mean that in the big sense, liberal societies where nobody's supposed to tell anybody else what to do with themselves, which is a position I generally agree with. I don't like people walking around telling me what to do all the time. But because of that liberal obsession with individual rights, and again, don't get me wrong, individual rights matter. I live in a country in which individual rights are on shaky ground, so I'm quite concerned about these matters. You've been following politics in the U.S.? Yeah, okay. It's getting a little weird over there. In fact, what are the political asylum rules like in Sweden? Could I ask you all to give me political asylum as an American escaping the... Well, we'll talk about that over lunch. Never. Because of this liberal obsession with individual rights and the underlying assertion that nobody can tell anybody anything about how to live their life, which is a strange thing when you think about human beings being social animals. We live in community. You can't live in community without concern about other people. How is it that we can imagine we can do whatever we want and never talk about the underlying moral questions? But there's a real, in the US at least, a real fear of talking about morality, especially in the context of sexuality. And in some sense, I agree with that, because the history of morality and discussions about sexuality has been largely patriarchal institutions like the church telling you, don't you do that, and make sure you don't do that, and you got to be married, but even if you're married, don't do that. You know, so this imposition of a moral demand on people has a really ugly history. But we're humans, and everything we do has a moral underpinning, right? The way we think about what it means to be human informs everything we do. And that's what I think is the foundation of moral dialogue, is what do we imagine it means to be a human being in community with other human beings? There's no escaping that. And so I think it's important, although liberal societies tend to run away from it, to ask the question, what is sex for? Beyond reproduction, what is sex for? What role does sexuality have in our lives? And I don't think there's a single answer to it. And I don't believe I would have any right to impose an answer on anyone. In fact, there's not one answer in our own lives. As we get older, what sex is for in any one life can change. When we're young, sex is, at least for many of us, a way we explore our own bodies, we explore relationships, you know, we're fumbling forward. As we get older, sex is often a way in pair-bonded relationships We signal a connection to another human being. Right? Sex has a lot of different roles, but at least we should talk about it so that we can come to some common understanding of the range of meanings of sexuality in the culture. And of course, when you do that, you realize sex is basically a mystery. Yes? I mean, you're thinking, oh wait, he's from the US, they don't do sex education there, let me no, I understand the mechanics. I mean, I live in Texas, and what passes for sex education in Texas is pretty scary, but what I mean by that is sexuality has an incredible power in our lives, yes? I mean, it is a powerful motivating force. I always say that if each one of us were to start making a list of things we have done in our lives that upon reflection don't really seem very smart, but we did them out of sexual desire. Yes? You know what I'm talking about? The stupid things you've done in your life that were rooted in desire. Am I the only one who's got a list like that? I mean, again, a Swedish thing. Yeah, okay. Come on, you've done stupid things too. I agree, Americans are disproportionately stupid, but we're not the only stupid people in the world. But that's what I mean by mystery. What you look back and you think, what the hell was I thinking? That's mystery. Okay, so what do human beings do when they confront mystery? Well, often when we confront mystery that exhausts our rational capacity to understand the world, we make art, yes? Humans make art. I always say that's why there's so much art about sex and about God, because we don't understand either concept, yes? No, I mean, God is that concept which goes beyond our rational capacity, whatever your own particular faith tradition. That's in a sense what God is. So there's a ton of art about God, and there's a lot of art about sex, because both of them are these mysterious things in our lives. Okay. I just want to be clear. I like art. Art is a good thing. Because those of us who have a critique of pornography are often accused of wanting to suppress art. No. Art is a good thing when people use art to explore the mystery of being human. Pornography is not art. It does not explore the mystery of being human, the mystery of sexuality. It exploits that. It does not open up our imaginations. In fact, it closes it down. Right? Pornography, I used to say, is like walking in through a door into a locked room. There is nowhere to go. The pornographic imagination does not open up, it closes down. So we want to talk about the struggle for intimacy in the 21st century. We have to talk about what a non-patriarchal, non-pornographic sexuality would be like. I think that's an important conversation to have. So let me take a minute and in some detail explain my own sexual practices that I use to try and become a non-patriarchal, non-pornographic man in the 21st century. You don't want to hear that, do you? No, I don't want to hear it either. Because there isn't an intimacy cookbook where you say, oh, this sexual practice is non-patriarchal, this sexual practice is patriarchal, I'll take this one and I'll combine it with a half a cup of sugar and life is great. No, it doesn't work that way. Intimacy doesn't reduce itself to rules. So instead of description, you can take a breath, a sigh, oh my God, he's not going to talk about himself, that's good. Instead of description, I want to offer a metaphor. And this, I first started thinking about from a phrase that we use a lot in the United States about an argument or a debate that's very spirited, angry, shouting, a debate where people are really going at it, but nobody's listening to each other. Right? You've no doubt been in such arguments and seen lots of them. If you haven't, just turn on cable TV in the United States. That's all it is. Debates where people shout and bluster, but don't listen or learn. And the phrase we use in the United States for that is it's a debate that produced more heat than light. I don't know if that phrase is used in Sweden. Right? So that kind of angry, intense engagement produces a lot of heat. You know, everybody gets all hot and bothered. But it produces no light. It doesn't help anybody understand the world. Right? A debate that produces more heat than light. And I started thinking about that in the context of sexuality. And the way that in contemporary culture, the conversation around sex is often about heat. What's the best kind of sex? Okay, this is the audience engagement part. What is the best kind of sex? Sex that is really... I said in the dominant culture. They don't play along. You're a very... Hot sex, yes? What's the best kind of sex? Hot sex. Thank you very much. Okay. That ends the audience engagement part of this presentation, by the way. Okay. But you hear that all the time, yes? At least in the United States, the language around sex is that the best sex is hot sex. You got to get it, and you got to get it hot. Okay. You know, hotness ratings. You know, men will rate women on how hot they are. This language of heat just permeates discussions about sexuality in the United States, at least. And so I started thinking about this argument that produces more heat than light, sex that has to be hot. And I started thinking, what would it be instead of desperately seeking hot sex? Which is what in the United States the whole culture is doing. It's this desperate search for hot sex. What if we thought about sex not as in terms of heat, but in terms of light? That changes things dramatically. What if our sexuality, which means our embodied connections to one another, were less about heat and more about light? That when we talked about sex, we didn't ask, was it hot? We asked, did it help shine a light not only on another person to learn about a partner, but on yourself? Because the one thing about real intimacy and sexual connections that go deep is it not only helps you understand another person, it helps you understand yourself. Right? Because in the end, I think most people agree that the most powerful sexual experiences we have are not about friction. They're about vulnerability. They're about when we open up. And when we open up, it is possible to see another person and to see ourselves more clearly. But that requires light. And so I don't have an intimacy instruction manual, but I think it's much more productive when we talk about sex, and to not be afraid to talk about sex, not to be afraid to talk about the moral underpinnings of sex in that context of what it means to be human, and to talk in terms of light, to go toward the light instead of obsessing about the heat. Now, again, I'm not going to offer a step-by-step instruction manual, but I will say that in my own life, it was not until I embraced radical feminism and the radical feminist critique of pornography that I could begin the process of dismantling my own pornographic imagination. And that's something I want to emphasize. I haven't talked much about myself, but I'm 60 years old. I was born in 1958. I was born in the post-Playboy world. First issue of Playboy hit the stands in 1953, and that opened up the pornographic gates. As a boy and a young man, I had this is pre-internet, but I had my own experiences of either by myself or with other boys, seeking pornography, finding pornography, using pornography well into my young adult years, and having that same conflicted engagement with it, finding it incredibly intense because pornography works to produce very intense sexual responses. But knowing there was something about that way of training myself sexually that was limiting myself as well. And it wasn't until someone gave me an explanation for that. And the explanation was the radical feminist critique of pornography. The explanation was an Andrea Dworkin book and all of the work that followed Andrea. That I could start to realize I had a lot of work to do to dismantle my own pornographic imagination. So I don't stand up here in a way that's kind of holier than thou saying, all right, you bad boys, you men, yeah, you over there, bad guy over there, look at that guy. Now, this is about all of us. It does no good to separate the world into good guys and bad guys. We're all socialized into the world differently depending on where, when, family backgrounds, all sorts of things. But at this point, every boy growing up in a world with an internet connection is going to be subject to this. All right. We talked about patriarchy. I gave you a quick run through of how I think we need to think about patriarchy. Talked about the pornography industry and the effects of pornography. And at this point, it's clear that everything I'm saying comes out of this radical feminist critique of patriarchy. I said one of my jobs in the world is to say patriarchy over and over again. The other job is to say radical feminism over and over again. Radical feminist. I'm a radical feminist. I follow radical feminist teachings. I read radical feminist women. I have radical feminist friends. Radical feminism, radical feminism. In fact, I think I'll just do the next. I've got about 8 minutes left. I think I'll just keep saying radical feminism until it doesn't seem so scary anymore. Because the word, if you think about radical feminism, at least again in the US context, radical is already scary, yes? Because radical people are dangerous people. Okay? And feminism is scary because we know feminists all hate men. So you put radical feminism together and you get extreme man-hating women. And if you're a guy, you don't have to know anything about radical feminism except that it's not going to end well for you. Yes? That's the way I was raised. Until I was 30 years old, I assumed that feminism was something that would hurt me. That if I took it seriously, bad things would happen. That if I spent too much time around women who identified as feminists, bad things would happen. And I'm a slow learner. It wasn't until I was 30 years old, and in my case, I went back to graduate school and had a chance to both read radical feminist writing, especially Andrea's work, and meet radical feminists working in these areas, that I realized how wrong I was. So let's just talk a little bit about radical feminism. This is my plea for people to take seriously radical feminism. What is it? Well, it's a critique of patriarchy that, again, does not shy away from the way that in patriarchy, men claim a right to own or control women's bodies. Now, that takes different forms around the world. You can go to some parts of the world and that claim of ownership is literal. There are still parts of the world where women essentially can be feudal property. If you think about the United States, there we're sort of past the point where men can claim to own women. And we've made great strides so that in the United States, women are no longer feudal property. Now they can be a capitalist commodity, yes? They can put themselves into the market to be bought or sold. Right. Again, objectified female bodies bought and sold for men's sexual pleasure. The radical feminist movement is not afraid to critique that in a world where many people are afraid. And that's why, you know, decades after the radical feminist movement was most successful at pushing this argument in public, at a point when that argument is now largely pushed to the margins, even by other feminists, I think it's important over and over again to talk about radical feminism. Radical feminism does not promise that your life will be easy. But is your life easy today? I think the most important thing radical feminism does is help us understand why we are so often in pain. And we are so often in pain in the contemporary world. Andrea said it this way about radical feminism. She said, this is a movement against suffering, but in a world where the... let me explain something about why I got a little nervous there. I'm from Texas, or I live in Texas. I'm not from Texas. I live in Texas, where there are a lot of guns. And when people start sneaking up behind you, like, what the... I've just learned to be a little nervous. That's okay. So contemporary consumer capitalism says if you're ever in pain, what do? Well, you go shopping. You take a pill. Right? Contemporary consumer capitalism has myriad ways to dull the pain. Right? Usually they involve spending money. Right? Does that make the pain go away? No, it dulls it. But it never helps you deal with it in that sense. And here's what Andrea said. One of the things the women's movement does is to make you feel the pain. Which is not a great, on the surface, sales pitch, yes? Come on into radical feminism. We're going to help you feel the pain. But it is, if you understand that the only thing worse than feeling that pain is denying that pain. And that's true for women, I think, most obviously. But I want to end and I don't think we're not gonna have time for questions, but I'm gonna be around, so I'm hoping we can talk during lunch if you have questions. But I want to end just with a specific pitch to men, and I know it's a predominantly female audience, but for those of you who are women and are trying to think about how do you talk to men in your own life about why feminism, right, is worth giving some thought to, maybe this will be helpful. And for the men in the room, I'd like to speak to you directly about my own experience. So radical feminism, right, offers obvious benefits to women. What about to men? Well, one response would be, who cares about men? Well, here's why I think it's important to think about this. There is always, I would argue, in support of feminism, an argument from justice. It's the right thing to do to support feminism. That's true of any situation where there is a group with more power and a group with less power. There's always an argument from justice that you should work to eliminate that power disparity. For instance, I'm white. I live in the United States, which has an ugly history and contemporary practice of white supremacy. And I don't think it's hard to make the argument that if one cares about justice, that is, if you care about the moral principles you claim to hold, principles around concepts like dignity and equality and solidarity, you are obligated to engage in struggles to challenge unearned privilege and power because it's the right thing to do. That's the argument from justice. But you may have noticed in the world, people don't always do the right thing. And so I think in addition to making the argument from justice, it's also important to make an argument from self-interest. That is, to argue to men that it's not only the right thing to do, it's in your own self-interest to embrace radical feminism. Why is that? Because when we are socialized into masculinity and patriarchy, right, that is a masculinity defined by competition, the kind of relentless competition that patriarchy demands. Always the goal of conquest, yes. If you're a real man, what are you trying to do? You're trying to win. And that, of course, means you're going to be in endless confrontations, especially with other men, because that jockeying for power. And in the end, it's all about control. Yes, men have to stay in control of self and control of everyone else. So the masculinity and patriarchy that we are socialized into is about competition, conquest, confrontation, and control. And guess what? That's a pretty miserable way to live. Right. Now, that kind of masculinity is very good it's very efficient in seeking pleasure of a certain kind. Right? If all you're after is intense pleasure, that kind of masculinity can provide it, but it cannot provide any sense of joy. Right? That kind of masculinity can help you control your own pain, but it never allows you to access your own grief, and feeling grief is part of being human. And so my argument is that if men want to be fully human, and I desperately want to be fully human, right, it is in our own self-interest to embrace not only feminism, but radical feminism, the feminism that we are taught most to fear. Right? And the best example of this in my own life is the radical feminist critique of pornography, because so many men have a visceral experience of being uneasy with their own pornography use. And so if you're trying to find ways to talk to men about this, and boys, I think one way to do it is not just to lecture about why pornography harms women in the world. It does. It harms women in the production and in the use of pornography. That is, I think, obvious. But there's also an argument to make to men that if you want to be the person that you claim you want to be, if you want to be fully human, radical feminism is your best vehicle toward that. Yes, there's an argument from justice that is compelling, but there's an equally compelling argument from self-interest. And I want to end with a quote from someone that I think captures this. His name is James Baldwin. For my money, Andrea Dworkin and James Baldwin are the two most compelling American writers in the last half of the 20th century, both brilliant in their own way. And Baldwin said it this way: I think the inability to love is the central problem, because the inability masks a certain terror. And the terror is the terror of being touched. And if you can't be touched, you can't be changed. And if you can't be changed, you can't be alive. And for those of us who are men, I think that is literally what is at stake. Do we want to be alive? Or do we want to give in to the masculinity and patriarchy that shuts down our own capacity to feel not only joy, but the grief that is inevitably part of being human? And that's why I say, and this is where I'll finish, is that I was taught my whole life that feminism was a threat. That whatever feminism was going to do, it was going to threaten me. And what I learned, largely because of the work of women like Andrea and my friend Gail, is that feminism is not a threat to men. Feminism, especially radical feminism, is a tremendous gift to us. So thank you. Appreciate it.